Do you have a thirst to learn about wine? Do you love stories about wonderfully obsessive people, hauntingly beautiful places, and amusingly awkward social situations? Well, that's the blend here on the Unreserved Wine Talk podcast. I'm your host, Natalie McLean, and each week I share with you unfiltered conversations with celebrities in the wine world, as well as confessions from my own tipsy journey as I write my third book on this subject. I'm so glad you're here. Now pass me that bottle, please, and let's get started. Welcome to episode 23. In today's episode, we're chatting with rockstar California winemaker Randall Grahm of Bonny Doon Winery, who blends wit and wisdom unlike any other person in the wine world. He's brilliant, both in his insights and his metaphors, which are often funny too. That's why I chose to help him with the fall harvest for my second book, Unquenchable, a Tipsy Search for the World's Best Bargain Wines. His wines are also often favorites of the students in my online courses. Now be sure to stay tuned for a bonus treat at the end, after I share my takeaways from our chat. Think of it like that extra scene you get at the end of a superhero movie, after the credits finish rolling. Enjoy. This man that I'm about to bring on, this winemaker, he has hosted a funeral for corks in New York's Grand Central Station. He has added rocks to fermenting wine, and he's had a meteor named after him. But aside from all that, he's onto some very exciting projects lately. We're going to hear about those as well. And he makes spectacular wine. Live from California, it's Randall Grahm. Randall, hello, welcome.
Good afternoon.
Let's dive right into it. Can you remember that moment, or describe to us that moment when you know for the first time that you wanted to make wine?
Well, in fairness, this is a retrospective moment. So in other words, I didn't realize it at the time, but I realized it later that at the time that was the germ of the idea that got me interested in winemaking. And I was actually visiting a woman in Denmark in the island of Jutland, Jylland. And this was a woman who taught music at a high school there. And she made flower wine, which they called hul.
That sounds like an owl.
I know. And she had bottles of this in her bathroom on her toilet in the bathtub, kind of bubbling away. And I thought, this is kind of vaguely alchemical and very cool. I should file this away sometime for the future. And that was, I think, the first notion that even winemaking as a thing existed.
So you're fascinated with the technology and the chemistry of it first, as opposed to being out in some sort of idyllic vineyard and going, oh, this would be a nice life.
I think it was the spectacle of the bubbles that were more than anything.
You were drawn to the bubbles.
Drawn to the bubbles.
You've had such an interesting life. Can you tell us your worst moment when it came to winemaking, kind of a low, if you will, during your winemaking career?
I was going to say with pleasure, except it's not with pleasure. It's
okay.
The opposite of pleasure.
Okay.
With the gnashing of teeth. The worst moment, I think, in my life was seeing the home vineyard, the estate vineyard in Bonny Doon, develop Pierce's disease. That was a drag. And I thought initially that somehow I had brought in some bizarre disease from Europe, and I was single-handedly destroying the entire California wine industry.
That's a lot to carry.
It's a lot to carry. I thought they're going to call this thing Graham's disease. The history books will say it was believed that California once had a flourishing wine industry until this guy, this hippie in the Santa Cruz Mountains, totally destroyed it.
There's a legacy.
Yes. But it turned out it was Pierce's disease, which comes around every 50 or 100 years. We were on a 100-year cycle.
Oh.
And all the vineyards in Bonny Doon got wiped out. And
really?
A lot of the vineyards in the Santa Cruz Mountains were affected. Unfortunately, we got affected by the wimpy vector, the blue-green sharpshooter, and then along comes the glassy wing sharpshooter 2 years later, which flew 5 times as far and was more voracious eater. So I thought, if I get wiped out by the wimpy vector and there's now a super vector, this vineyard is toast.
What does it do? Does it just eat the roots or the leaves, or?
It inoculates. It has a kind of a needle-like nose, proboscis. Mm-hmm. It's like a syringe. It inoculates the plant with this bacteria, and the bacteria colonizes the vascular tissue, and it's like arterial sclerosis. It plugs up the xylem so that the plant can't translocate water.
That's just nasty.
It's nasty, yeah.
Oof. Is there anything you can do to fight against it? Once you get it, can you fight it, or it's just a matter of planting different rootstocks? Or
unfortunately, there's no groovy, organic way of combating it. The only way you can do it is really to put out pheromone traps and observe the presence of the vector of the insect. If you've got the insect, you've got problems. And unfortunately, there are no really good, gentle, natural insecticides. You unfortunately have to nuke your vineyard back into the Stone Age.
Oh, wow.
Which is a drag.
Just brutal. But the upside is it's not known as Graham's disease.
Correct. That's the good side, the good news.
Oh, dear. Okay, so let's counterbalance that then. Take us to the best moment so far of your winemaking career. Tell us exactly kind of where you were, what was happening.
There are a couple of best moments. I mean, I live in the future and I live in a dream world. Real life things are just not all that interesting to me. You know, once they've happened, it's like, okay, that was great. What's next? What are we going to do next? But things that have like a cycle where I've started something from the beginning and I've seen it through to the end, that's very satisfying. So I honestly have to say, I mean, it's just a goofy thing. I bought this property in San Juan Bautista, which we call Populachum, which is our new estate.
Populachum?
Populachum.
Okay.
Yeah. I dreamt about this place before I saw it.
Really?
And then I saw it in real life. And, you know, that's kind of new agey and woo-woo, but it really happened. So we planted some Grenache there in the nursery row, and this very special clone of Grenache. But nevertheless, we made a little bit of wine just 2 years ago, 2015, from this nursery row. We only made 30 gallons. We made it in a big garbage can and not exactly ideal conditions. And the wine is perfect. It's absolutely perfect. If you don't mind, I'll tell you a little anecdote. It was about 4 years ago, we did a vertical tasting of Cigare Volant. We did 25 vintages of Cigare Volant, beginning with an 84 vintage out of large format bottles. So these were 3 liters, 5 liters, 9 liters, 12 liters. It was totally extravagant tasting. Of all the wines we tasted that evening, the 2 most interesting wines were the 84 and the 85. When I didn't understand anything about anything, I wasn't a very good winemaker. I didn't know anything particularly, but those were the 2 best wines. I don't know exactly what the point is, but it's something like when you're connected to the universe in some fashion, things happen in a magical kind of way that you can't necessarily access through your intellect. The intellect only takes you so far. The good news is that now I'm sort of feeling that same sense of connection at Populachum that I had 30 some odd years ago when I started. That's a beautiful thing.
Things seem to come full circle in a good way. And
circle of life.
Yeah, you're knowing the beginning like it was the end or something. Whatever that line is that in Lord Tennyson's? Anyway, tell us more about this. I know it's a very special piece of land, but are there specific grapes there, or how are you farming it?
It's pretty complicated, but we're trying to do some interesting things. One, of course, we're doing a simple thing, which is we're trying to dry farm, which is how things were done 100 years ago. Not so much anymore. It's tricky because it's not a particularly high rainfall area, so it's kind of a dry area. So we're using some special technology to help us dry farm. We're using a material called biochar, which is essentially activated charcoal and a whole bunch of compost to enhance the water holding capacity of the soil. Obviously, the vines are trained in a certain way. They're head trained. It's a very old-fangled looking vineyard. It's not a modern vineyard at all.
Are they like the gnarly vines like you see with Zinfandel? Are they kind of bushy?
Well, they're not gnarly yet, but they'll get gnarly over time.
Okay.
I trust. It's a mixed plantation. We planted other trees and bushes and flowering shrubs in the middle of the vineyard. So it's more like a garden than an actual vineyard. We're trying to develop a very diverse insect and bacterial population in the vineyard, a little more of a holistic approach, if you will, a biosphere.
They do mention that. I know certain regions I've visited in Europe, they talk about the vineyard as the garden. It just sounds idyllic, but also a way of looking at it holistically, as you say. And the grapes that are planted there, are they all Rhône?
Well, at the moment, we've planted just Grenache Blanc and Grenache Gris and Fourment, of all things. So there's 2 big projects that we're attempting, and we're at the very early stages of this. One project, I call it auto-tuning.
Okay.
And that's the idea of taking a variety that we think we like, we think does well, and then iterating upon it, which is to say, allowing the vines to pollinate themselves, cross with themselves, taking the offspring, the seedlings, germinating them, planting them out, and finding the particular variants that appear to be the best suited to the site. So it's kind of like sélection massale on steroids, or sélection massale kind of times 10,000.
Massal, selection massal.
Sélection massale is there's random variation in vineyards owing to mutation.
Sure.
So this is actually not mutation, this is actually genetic recombination. But sélection massale takes advantage of the individual vines that appear to be best suited to the site at that particular site. And then they observe it over a period of years, take cuttings of that, and when they replant, they use those cuttings to gradually, if you will, improve their vineyard, or make it more of itself, or get more of the character that they're looking for in that vineyard.
Right. That totally makes sense. Randall, let's just go back a little bit because we just still want to know those stories since I teased everybody with them. I know the past is fast for you, but tell us, how did you get that name or that moniker, Rhône Ranger?
I don't really remember exactly, except Wine Spectator called me up and they said, one request, would you mind bringing a horse to the photo shoot? A white horse, particularly. If you don't mind bringing a white horse to the photo shoot.
Not to be too picky, but yeah, okay.
Yeah, so I did. And I thought, okay, whatever. They just wanted a horse. My neighbor had a horse, so that was great. Then I was on the cover of the Wine Spectator as the Rhône Ranger, and that name stuck.
Well, I'm sure it did. Yeah, it's catchy, as was the blue polyester suit that you were appearing in. Do you still have that old chestnut?
It was a neighbor's horse, and the polyester suit was a rental, thank goodness.
I see. Okay, good.
But allow me to say one thing. Forgive me for being a little didactic. You know, the name Rhône Ranger has been very catchy, and it's been helpful to my cause. And there's a group called the Rhône Rangers of people who are interested in Rhône varieties. The issue I have, though, is that we in California ultimately somehow need to get out of the shadow of our European colleagues, if you will, and somehow learn how to redefine ourselves on our own terms rather than as something derivative or something referential to something else. Who wants to be the second best, something like something else? You want to be your own thing. At least I do. I think we, in the New World, have to get there somehow.
Have you got there yet?
I'm working on it. I'm really working on it. And I think the way to get there for me personally is try to figure out what can we do in the New World that can't be done in the Old World that's interesting and wonderful and pleasurable. But let's do it and find the grapes, whether it's one grape or many grapes, that are uniquely suited to our sites, rather than take something else and try to make Burgundian style Pinot Noir or Côte Rôtie like Syrah or Barolo-ish Nebbiolo, for example.
So what have you changed lately that's getting you closer to that? Besides this piece of land, of course, and what you're doing with it, but is there anything else that you feel is getting you toward that goal?
The last piece of the big project we have at Populus Shum is this breeding program of breeding new varieties. It's very open-ended. It's maybe too open-ended, but the point of it is that it's putting logic on its head, which is to say, instead of looking for the best of something, try to figure out how to create the maximum amount of interesting, useful diversity. So if you, for example, breed grapes from common parents and you have 10,000 siblings, the question becomes, what would a wine taste like that was made from 10,000 members of the same family, all a little bit different from one another? Would that give you a unique opportunity to taste something of unequaled complexity and nuance, or would it be just complete noise and cacophony? Nobody knows because nobody's ever tried it.
Right. Yeah. And you've tried lots of things. And so you're on the path, at least, of trying to discover that. What were you doing adding rocks to wine as it was macerating?
It seemed like a good idea at the time. It was actually not a bad idea. I'm still trying to get a handle on what this thing that we call minerality is or might be. And I still think it relates to minerals, of course. What we did is we took rocks, kind of ground them up, and put them in barrels. Actually, after the wine finished fermenting, I avoided calcareous rocks that were high in pH. But minerals, of course, they have free minerals. And so minerals affect the pH of the wine. What happened when we put the rocks in? We use different kind of granites and things like that. After a few days or a week, the wines actually had this quality of minerality that we talk about. Wow. They had more length and more sustain. They had depth to them. They were very, very interesting. Then, however, as the wine continued to leach the minerals, the cations, out of the rocks, the pH just kind of went through the roof. And then when pH goes crazy, the wine goes crazy and bad things happen. And then, of course, the ATF at the time totally freaked out.
The Bureau of Alcohol and
Tobacco and Firearms,
yeah,
yes.
That's always an odd combination.
Yeah, I was imagining the black helicopters circling overhead at any moment.
You have the target in sight. But okay, so the pH sort of put that on the back burner. But wouldn't there also be lead or whatever, because you're adding these things after fermentation? Fermentation, isn't that the great cleanser of all things? But rocks after the fact, might there be lead or whatever leaching in
Well,
there?
that's one of the things that the ATF was concerned about. But, there are these things in the soil as well. So, I mean, you're not really putting anything into the wine that wasn't in the soil. You're just doing it in a more concentrated fashion. And I think when you age wine in amphora, you're certainly extracting minerals from the amphora. There's nothing in nature that is inert. I mean, inert is kind of a relative term. Glass is pretty inert. Stainless steel is not stainless. There is some interaction in every vessel of some sort, some more than others.
And amphora, just for those who don't know, the big clay pots that are sort of traditional and making a comeback, I think, too, with orange wines and natural wines. And how do you feel about all of those trendy things right now? Not to dismiss them with that, but the orange wines and the natural wines. Are you part of that, or do you think it's defined, ill-defined?
Well, I'm not a joiner of groups or defined groups. And I love the fact that natural wine exists. The object of wine, whether it's natural wine or any kind of wine, must give pleasure. It can't just exist because it's a virtuous thing to do. It has to actually give people pleasure. So if you drink a so-called natural wine and you pretend to like it, you're really not accomplishing much, certainly for yourself. So a lot of natural wines to me are just bizarre, and I want to like them. I really want to like them, but some of them I just can't force myself to like for whatever reason.
Fair enough. They may not taste good. Okay, and the meteor. How on earth did you...
Actually, it was an asteroid.
Oh, it's an asteroid.
Asteroid.
What's the difference between an asteroid and a
I don't know.
Okay.
I'm not sure.
Well,
one is bigger than the other.
Okay.
Almost, but it was an asteroid.
And it was named after you, or
Correct.
your inspiration. How? Why did they name that?
There was an astronomer in Arizona, Ted Bowl, who's a very nice man who loves Bonny Doon wines. And when he discovers an asteroid, he gets to name it whatever he wants. So he named it the Rhône Ranger asteroid.
Maybe you should make friends with Elon Musk and you'll get a car named after you next. Or I don't know. Anyway, do you still describe yourself as a hippie?
I'm not a hippie. I mean, I'm the only person in Santa Cruz who doesn't smoke pot, for example. They're ready to throw me out if I don't shape up.
Oh, that's all right. Someone's got to drive and make the laws or whatever. Speaking of making the laws, here's the segue. Can you tell us the backstory on the name of this wine, Cigare Volant, Le Cigare Volant?
Le Cigare Volant. So Le Cigare Volant, this flying cigar, was intended as an homage to Châteauneuf-du-Pape. Okay. And it turns out in the early 1950s, in 53 and 54, there were quite a number of sightings of UFOs in North America and in Europe. Some people took this very seriously, including the mayor of one of the villages of Châteauneuf-du-Pape, who persuaded the town council to adopt an ordinance prohibiting the landing of UFOs in the vineyards of Châteauneuf-du-Pape. This is a real thing. It really happened. And the ordinance is still in the books, and of course, none have landed.
Well, it's because they outlawed it, right?
They outlawed it, and I needed to commemorate this truly stupid bit of legislation with a wine label.
With a spectacular wine. Oh, my goodness. So I have the 2010 and 2011 vintages. Do you have any of that handy there, Randall?
I sure do, as it turns out.
How convenient for us. So how would you describe this? I've always found it very savory, but do you have some tasting notes, if you will?
Well, they're sort of à la minute. The Cigare Volant is a blend of the principal grapes of Chateauneuf. So it's Grenache, Syrah, Mourvèdre, and Cinsault. And occasionally a little bit of Carignan sneaks in just because we can. This is the reserve. So what's interesting about the reserve, this is a very unorthodox way of aging wine. We assemble the wine in the spring after malolactic, and after the malolactic is done, we rack the wines into demijohns, into carboys, 5-gallon carboys, seal them up nice and tight, add some sulfur, seal them up, put them on their sides, and then inside the bottles, we put in little Teflon-coated metal bars, and then we use strong magnets to perform patonnage magnétique, if you will, stirring up the lees. The result is you get this sort of preternatural level of savoriness as a function of all that lees extraction. Makes a very stylized wine, which is definitely a matter of taste, but I rather like it.
Oh, yeah, it's fantastic. And then, just to give you the full lineup, there's Le Cigare Blanc, so the white wine. And that would be, I would assume, traditional white varieties from the Rhône Valley.
Correct.
Correct. Okay. Do you have...
I have the 11 Reserve.
That's what I have. Whatever you're doing with that process, there's a real savory note to both, especially the reds, but this is beautiful.
Well, I think, honestly, we're still trying to figure out, it's a powerful technique, and I want to figure out how to use it for good and not for evil.
That's a good thing.
And strangely, my tentative hypothesis is that it's more interesting for the white and the pink than it is for red. It adds such a strong dimension to the wine. The white and the pink have more space, whereas red has so much information. This is like adding still more information.
So I like the metaphors, but how does a white have more space?
From a flavor impression standpoint. So in other words, the flavor is not as dense. You don't have tannin. You don't have this strong fruitiness. It's like a musical composition. It's a jazz composition. There's more time between the notes. There's more air, if you will, between the notes.
Well, that's great.
If that makes any sense.
Yeah, it does, actually.
So certain reds, for example, like Pinot Noir or Grenache, there's kind of an airiness to the wine compared to Cabernet, where flavors are very, very dense.
Right, absolutely. Have you had particularly good vintages that you would want to highlight, or is it getting more and more consistent from year to year?
I think so. I don't know what's being sold right now in Canada, but the 12 is what we're selling these days in the US. Okay. The 12 is really delicious. Really, there's been a big change in cigar since 2001. We actually switched over to screw caps in 2001. We had a brief period, 98 and 99, using synthetic closures, which were a unmitigated disaster. So if you have a 98 or 99, sorry, you're out of luck.
Why were they a disaster?
I was coming off of some bad cork experiences. That's why we had the funeral for Monsieur Bouchon.
Thierry Bouchon, which is
Thierry
French
Bouchon.
For corkscrew?
Corkscrew, Thierry Bouchon.
In New York's Grand Central Station.
Correct, the Campbell Apartments of Grand Central Station.
Just a quiet little affair.
Yes, we had a hearse and a coffin and a corpse made out of corks.
Was it open casket?
It was open casket, indeed.
Oh, okay. And did you deliver the eulogy?
Actually, Jancis Robinson delivered the eulogy, which was
That's great.
A coup de théâtre, if you will.
Absolutely. Wow. It must have been an emotional event.
It was great. It was amazing. It was amazing.
That's great.
And then we had a wake for Monsieur Bouchon, where we ate black food, just all black food from À rebours, from Huysmans' novel, Against the Grain. Anyways, it was an interpretation of a literary feast where the character just had black food served. I thought that was appropriate.
That's amazing. Wow, that's great. Okay, so you came off that and you went to screw caps that have an alien on them. So you're still banning all the aliens, presumably from your winery as well?
Well, no, they're welcome. In fact, I'm sure they can make a contribution. But the point is that the screw caps, I think, are brilliant for this style of wine. So I think the point is that the cigar conserves a lot better with a screw cap than it does with a cork.
And why is that?
Less oxygen permeability. I'm not 100% sure, but I'm pretty sure. All things being equal, the same wine sealed with a screw cap will live 50% longer than the equivalent wine with a cork. It'll be a slightly different evolution. But for these varieties, meaning the Rhône varieties or Pinot Noir, it's perfect.
Because they don't benefit from that egress of oxygen, that in and out, that little bit that you get with cork, that they argue that that's why wine can age if you have that little bit of oxygen coming in?
Rubbish, total rubbish.
Okay.
Wine needs oxygen at different stages in its life. In the élevage in the cellar, it absolutely needs oxygen for the tannins to condense. That requires oxygen. After the tannins are resolved, the so-called development of bottle bouquet is a totally anaerobic reaction. It doesn't need oxygen at all. The only issue why you'd want a little ingress of oxygen is if there's some residual sulfides in the wine, some reductive issues. If the wine still had this strong reductive capacity, you could move some of those elements and they'd have a slightly funky, reduced nose, which is pretty ephemeral. You don't need to burn down the winery in that event.
Right. You could decant that off? Like, would that blow off?
Ultimately, those qualities go away with time. If it's just ephemeral, you just decant it and it's no harm, no foul.
Okay. Now, the other thing you're on to, because I don't want to forget to ask you about this, are you pushing for ingredient labeling on wine?
Yes, I think we have problems in doing that in Canada. I don't think we're allowed to indicate the ingredients on our Canadian bottlings or exports. Even the TTB is pretty freaked out by what we're doing.
Why are they freaked out?
Because it's different. Is this going to be on the test? Are we going to get in trouble? Is there any liability? And it's different because it's different. But I am a strong advocate for transparency and for ingredient labeling. I think it's very confusing. Ingredient labeling is confusing for customers, but I think ultimately it provokes them to ask questions and learn something about the wine. And as a consumer, I think it's really good information.
How does it help a consumer, especially if there's these long words that we see on food packages? Won't it just scare them, or?
It will scare some of them. But for example, let's say you're a vegan and you don't want, I don't know, some kind of fish product or milk in your wine or caseinate. I would want to know, for example, if I was buying a wine, did it have mega purple added to it? That would be good information.
What's mega purple?
It's an additive that many wineries in California, and not so much in Europe, because I think it's against the law there. It's a concentrate of Teinturier grapes. So it gives the wine a very dark color and a little bit more texture. We wine drinkers often have visual biases. And so I think if a wine is darker in color, generally that adds like 3 points to the score. And being competitive as we are, winemakers like higher scores. And anyways, I don't like the addition of mega purple. I think it gives the wine kind of an artificial character.
So net, it would be a benefit to have all of these ingredients. Over time, people would ask more questions and become more knowledgeable
and have a better sense of, I don't really like wines that have this, or I really like wines that have that. I think ultimately it's an opportunity for people to learn, to become better wine tasters and better appreciators of wine. And I think it makes winemakers less lazy. I think you have to say to yourself, if I've got to put this on the label, do I really need to add this to the wine? Maybe there's another way I can make a good wine without having to resort to this particular trick.
Absolutely. Back to wine writers. What's your latest opinion on scores and everything else? I mean, you've seen it all, Randall, but is it just some sort of weird symbiotic relationship? You need each other, but don't necessarily like each other. What's your opinion on scores, wine writers?
Can't stand scores. I think they're just trivial and I just don't like them. I think they do a disservice because they don't really get to the nature of the wine. I mean, wine is something that's constantly evolving. I mean, something is a 92 on a given day, and it's a 99 on another day, and it's a 70 on another day. And a lot of it depends on how you feel. We are very imperfect. I mean, this is the dirty secret that wine writers don't want anyone to know, and winemakers too. Our feelings about a given wine, my feelings about a given wine are up and down and up and down. One day I might love it and then hate it. So you never want to taste a wine once and come to a conclusion about it. I need to follow it over a period of time and really make sure that I understand it from the inside out before making a final judgment about it.
And that sounds great in an ideal world. I'm just going to be devil's advocate because I resisted scoring wines at the beginning, but people want that shorthand. They want that, don't make me think. I mean, I know you want people to think, but when they're shopping for a consumer product, they want, like, do you like it or not? Is it 89? Is it 91?
what is the difference between a 91 and an 89?
Perception.
Yeah. So,
they cross that 90 threshold, and it's like a lot of people will only shop 90 and up. And they say 95 is the new 90 now.
Right. Anyways, I resist this with every fiber of my being. What else can I say?
I don't know. I could keep poking at it and we'll see if you say something else. But I agree with you. You know, it's a subjective experience, and sometimes, total transparency, I'll go to a tasting, I'll score a wine, I'll even like it, I'll go buy it, and I'll open it and go, what was I thinking? I mean,
Yeah.
because I'm also tasting with like 30, 40, 50 wines, which is crazy. And it depends on, was I in a white tasting lab or am I at dinner with somebody I like? And you know all that. But
yeah, sure.
But there's the practical side too. Like if you're trying to be of service to readers, consumers, and so on, who still want that notation. And there's so many wines to taste. And this sounds like I'm whining. Wine writers whining. To come back to a wine 6 times and go, okay, here's the track and here's the evolution and here, anyway, it's a divisive issue. So do you have someone who is an inspiration to you, Randall, in the wine world or elsewhere for what you do?
Yeah, I mean, the great winemakers of the world, I mean, I obviously stand on their shoulders. When I was younger, I had a chance to spend some time with Gerard Chave, and that was amazing. And Henri Jaillet, of course, who's genius. So any winemaker who has created something just marvelous, it's still a miracle to me. And one of the things that you find about European winemakers, by and large, even the greatest ones, is this immense humility. And it's sincere. It's not an act. They're incredibly humble. And I think that's been a real gift that I have to try to keep in mind because, anyways.
Why do you think that comes more naturally to them, the humility?
They realize that they're part of a continuum, that it doesn't end with them, that they're a custodian, they're passing this on. The Chaves have been making wine in the same place for like 800 years. They're just part of a chain, and they're going to be gone, but the vineyard remains, and the vineyard is really what is there to be cherished. It's not necessarily their great skill, it's the brilliance of the vineyard. They love their place, their vineyard, so much. It's amazing. They just have a deep, deep, deep affection.
Wow, that's great. Do you have a favorite wine that you're drinking now other than your own?
There's a variety that I'm pretty excited about. It's not the world's greatest variety, noblest. I mean, the noblest, of course, is Pinot Noir from Burgundy, but there's a funny grape that you should all try if you can find it. In France, they call it Tibourin. In Italy, they call it Rossese. In Liguria, the results are kind of variable. Some of them are more interesting than others, but when they're good, they're very elegant. They're super savory, refreshing, and they kind of behave a little bit like Burgundy in that sense. Okay. So I think it's a variety that has enormous potential for elegance in a Mediterranean climate.
That sounds awesome. Randall, I think we'll wrap this up because, again, you've been so generous and patient with your time. Is there anything that we haven't covered that you'd like to share with us, and or a parting tip about wine or whatever you like?
Oh my gosh, where do we even... 2 things for the sort of semi-novice wine person. One is, don't go crazy. Don't fall in love with anything, because if you're just starting to learn about wine, it's a journey and your tastes are going to change. So don't make the mistake of buying 12 bottles of an oaky Chardonnay just because you like oaky Chardonnays, because in a year from now, you're not going to like oaky Chardonnays. So don't do that. And then the second thing is, be aware of the fact, you can think of it as a dichotomy, but it's really more of a continuum. There's a difference between what I would call real wines and confected wines. We in the wine industry do our best to confound people as far as that distinction. I'm not saying that every New World wine is bad and every Old World wine is great, but there is something wholesome about an artisanal wine, about a wine that is made, that is not irrigated. Maybe the wine is farmed organically or biodynamically, smaller scale production. There's something special about these artisanal wines that come from special places. And we call them both wine, but they're different. One is a more industrial product and one is an artisanal product. And I would argue the artisanal product is capable. Sometimes the artisanal product can be a little austere or quirky, and it may not be as forthcoming. But ultimately, I would argue it's much more satisfying wine than a wine that it's just made cynically just to simply please this confected wine, if you will.
Good advice and encouragement for continuing the wine journey, Randall. We appreciate that.
My pleasure.
So, yeah, I think we will wrap this up now. Randall, thank you so much. Wish you all the best with that very special piece of land, with your family, and with all of the plans, legacy building you have yet to do.
My pleasure. Thank you.
All right, Randall. I look forward to chatting with you again soon.
Sounds great.
Okay,
Thanks,
take
Nat.
care. All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Oh, marvelous. Randall truly is an old soul who lives in the future. Here are my takeaways from our chat. Number 1. Despite his formidable smarts, Randall is both humble and wise. I love the way he talks about how making wine connects him to the universe in a way that the intellect can't access. 2. The resilience of those in the wine and other agricultural fields is just truly astonishing to me. Their entire business can be wiped out with one tiny insect or a climactic event, and still they start over. 3. New wine words of the week. Sélection massale. Deciding which vine cuttings do best in a particular region and using them for new plantings. This technique is also used to preserve genetic diversity in the vineyard. Sélection massale. Just love saying it. 4. Also love Randall's word old-fangled in reference to the importance of dry farming and the use of biochar or activated charcoal in the vineyard to make the vines stronger on their own and without reliance on irrigation. 5. He makes a wise observation about California and other New World wine regions getting out of the shadow of Old World or European regions. For example, the Rhône Rangers, a nod to Rhône Valley-style wines made in California, certainly helped him, as he acknowledges, but he finds the term derivative. California can define its own style of Syrah blends. Amen to that. 6. It surprised me that wines closed under screw caps can age up to 50% longer than those under cork, and that the small egress of oxygen through a cork is not what helps age wine. 7. Another great insight about winemakers from family-owned wineries, particularly in the Old World, their humility often comes from realizing that they're part of a continuum that started long before they were alive and will go on long after their death. I think that's a great mindset for all of us. 8. Don't forget to keep listening after the usual endnotes here for that special bonus from Randall. He's reading from his own poem, the love song of J. Alfred Rootstock from his book, Doon So Long. It's hilarious and so very smart. Now, did you know that you can listen to this podcast on your smart speaker? Just say, "Hey Google," or "Alexa, play the Unreserved Wine Talk podcast." I'd love to chat with you about wine while you're doing the dishes, the laundry, having breakfast, lunch, or dinner. It's always wine time. You'll find links to the wines we discuss, Randall's social media handles and website, and a link to the video edition of this chat in the show notes at nataliemaclean.com/23. So what was your favorite tip or quote from this episode? Share that with me on Twitter or Facebook and tag me at Natalie MacLean. On Instagram, I'm at Natalie MacLean Wine. If you like this episode, please tell a friend about it. My podcast is easy to find, whether you search on its name, Unreserved Wine Talk, or on my name. Finally, if you want to take your ability to pair wine and food to the next level, join me in a free online video class at nataliemaclean.com/class. My next guest on the show will be Morgan Perry, who pairs wine and yoga in her Vino Vinyasa classes. Find out whether Cabernet or Shiraz pairs best with the down dog pose, and more. It's actually a lot more than marketing or whimsy. It's rooted in a holistic lifestyle philosophy, and you won't want to miss it.
I'm going to start reading a poem I wrote years ago called The Love Song of J. Alfred Rootstock. Let us go then, you and I, when the soucoupe and Cigare Volant hover in the nighttime sky like a tea service upon a table. Let us excavate through heavily rummaged bargain bins, the radically reduced everything must go red-tagged wholesale outlet tins of dented canned goods, rising like armor-plated ziggurats, and deeply discounted lees-filtered, just say no to dregs, and I like that line, ends of vats, emerald aisles giving on to architectonic floor stacks, smudged shelf talkers artlessly affixed with thumbtacks. Oh, do not ask, is this cab fruity, floral, or weedy? Tais-toi and drink up, sweetie. In the warehouse, the salesmen come and go, complaining about what's moving slow. The vin jaune that gathers dust in the bargain bin, the Moscato Giallo matterizing in the bargain bin, rotating its chemise, a sedimental education, to one side, nestling in a colony of lately harvested Porto di White Zin, contains wine, another new warning label espied. Those cloudy white Christmas dioramas, those of soiled label, the unprepossessing, just give it some time, it's going through a dumb phase, cases. Unmerchantable, mallow in the bottle wines with proteins quite unstable, deplete at an imperceptible rate approaching stasis. And indeed, there will be time for the vin jaune that gathers dust, moldering in remaindered ignominy. There will be time to prepare the pectic enzyme for inclusion in the must. There will be time to sulfate and to acidulate, time to let the skins carbonically macerate, time for a velvety Hermitage and for a plump Côte Rôtie, and time yet for absolute perfection, a wine 100-pointed, consecrated by the Pope, we know who that is, a wine solemnly anointed, before the taking of grappa and biscotti. In the warehouse, the salesmen come and go, complaining about what is moving slow. And indeed, there will be time to wonder, do I filter and do I fine? Time to reorganize my bottling line with a hollowness in the middle of my wine. They will say, how his wine is growing thin. My Dubrovnik open gold medals pinned proudly to my chin. They will say, but how his middle body is so thin. Do I dare deburb the universe? In a nanosecond, there is time for decanting and recanting, and for stylistic decisions and label revisions that a 57 in the Spectator will reverse. For I have known all the perfect wine and food pairings, known them all, have known the most appropriate wine for pasta, man. I have measured out my life with a Tostavan. And I have known the wine writers, known them all, the wine writers that fix you in a formulated phrase, like gobs of upfront jammy fruit in your face. And when the wine is released and reviewed, when my marketing efforts begin to stall and my stylistic effects are roundly booed, then how should I essay, bulk out all the lees and dregs of superannuated puncheons, barrels, kegs, to make a wine of great complexity? And I have known the legs already, known them all, legs that cling and sheet along the leaded glass, but whose spirit derives from elements far more crass. Is it perfume from a beaker that makes me a digressive speaker? Legs as silky as a summer's breeze, rich, unctuous mouthfeel, perhaps an infusion of antifreeze. And how should I begin to correct the errors of my ways and of my cuvées? Shall I say I have gone at dawn through widely spaced vineyard lanes and remained passive in lights of yields so frankly massive? I have seen the best vines of my generation cropped to a fare thee well. I figured, hey, grower knows best. I should have been a pair of port tongs scuttling across the floors of a well-stocked cellar.
You don't want to miss one juicy episode of this podcast, especially the secret, full-bodied bonus episodes that I don't announce on social media. So subscribe for free now at nataliemclean.com/subscribe. Meet me here next week. Cheers.